To open our conference this year, I'm delighted to welcome Yvonne Keating, Chief Inspector at the Department of Education in the South, and Faustina Graham, Chief Inspector of the Education Training Inspectorate in the Department of Education, Northern Ireland. Your presence today and the time that I know has gone into preparing a very thoughtful opening to our conference gives us hope and optimism that our voices, the voice of Scotans, are part of the dialogue on education on the island of Ireland. Thank you both for your ongoing support of Scotans. We look forward to continuing today's conversation and to deepening our relationships. I'll now hand over to Yvonne Keating, Chief Inspector of the Department of Education, to open our conference.
Gurv Mahaga Julie as Octan Folche Jas Shin. Thank you very much, Julie, for that very warm welcome. And if I could start with a few words in Irish on behalf of Faustina and myself. Tá an áthas orm féin agus Faustina bheithan seo live inniu ag olcogáil Scotans. Stola dosíon obair an le go firmú, bhil an beagán a rá fún féin agus fao Faustina. Mar zoldi Yvonne is anam domsa agus mar dúir Julie is mise an príomh cigare is the Rhaine Dácis I Maileád lia. Solar cappa mar cigare mé bhúntóir bun scola mé agus bhún mé le tréimhse I gáthair Maileád lia. Sa cigareacht bhí mé I ganas ar hail nua cigareacht ar Orbert do réimsí mar cosint leanaí agus cleachtais ar cuimsíthacha. Now, tá sim faoi lethe agam ar an junker a bhín ag na cigareachtaí ar an ghlaachtas garamú sa seomar ranga agus I scolanna éagsúla, agus an fios dearafach a chuireann sé seo ar chaidán na fólama do leanaí agus do dhaoine óga. Now, Faustina, like myself, began her career as a teacher. Faustina was an English and drama teacher, and Faustina has worked in a range of policy areas in the education ministry, and including shared education, integrated education, and Irish medium education. And I know from my many engagements and encounters with Faustina over the years that she has a particular interest in teacher professional development and in leadership development. And recently, Faustina has really successfully led a really exciting development in the development of inspection in Northern Ireland, a bespoke inspection model that really takes the context of every single school into account. And we and our inspectorate really value the opportunities to learn from Faustina's inspectorate also. As you can gather, we work closely together on a one-to-one basis, on a cross-inspectorate basis, and also in a national and international context through the Standing International Conference of the Inspectorates. So, Faustina, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Thank you, Yvonne, and good afternoon, everyone. I would just like to add my appreciation to Yvonne's for the invitation to come this afternoon and address the conference. We feel very privileged to have this opportunity to meet with you this afternoon. As Yvonne said, we work very closely together, and we were delighted last year to have that recognised as best practice in North-South collaboration. And so I think all the more reason why we're delighted to endorse the work that you're doing as well in terms of all of that North-South work. So as Yvonne said, we're quite comfortable in each other's company, and we thought maybe for a change it might be nice to do something different for the opening remarks, and rather than each say our little bit, we thought maybe we would have a structured conversation just around some of the conference themes. But with the same intent really as anyone doing opening remarks would have, insofar as talking about the conference themes, to allow you an opportunity to reflect, to think, and also to begin, I think, that discussion and debate around this really important aspect of education. So we're going to touch on a few areas this afternoon, and I think what we want to talk about are things like what inclusion means across the island of Ireland in 2024 and into the future. And to consider a little bit also what are the main enablers and what are the main challenges around that for all of us. Also, I think how children and young people participate in both the creation and the implementation of inclusive practice and pedagogies, and how that is becoming increasingly, I think, more common. And what we all can do, I think, for children and young people who are at risk of being excluded or disengaged from learning. And we thought that was really interesting, particularly when one of your speakers tomorrow was talking about that whole experience of either young people or adults who are in prison. We'd also like to touch, again, looking at the conference theme, on how inspection can contribute to the development of an enabling policy climate that supports the broader aims of inclusion. And just to make sure that everybody listens, we're going to throw down a challenge to all of us at the end of this conversation. And what we're going to be asking is something just around that whole area of how what you do, what schools do, what inspectorates do, are certainly different in some ways and unique, but also how can we actually think about how all of those elements can be complementary to each other? Because, as we said, we have worked collaboratively together, you have too, and I think there's something about how we can explore themes in education which allows us to look much more holistically at some of the big issues that none of us can actually answer individually. So hopefully that will keep us focused on our conversation this afternoon. And I'm going to begin by asking Yvonne then. Yvonne, if you can tell the audience just a little bit about what inclusion means in your jurisdiction.
Thanks very much, Faustina. I'd start by saying that in Ireland we're on a journey in terms of our understanding of inclusion. And I'd look at this maybe from three main angles. For many, many years in Ireland, when we spoke of inclusion, we were focused on ensuring that children with special educational needs could access mainstream education. Now, that emphasis on children with special educational needs accessing mainstream education derived essentially from a series of legal cases that were taken against the state. One of the most high profile of those being the Sinnott case, which was taken in the 90s. So there was a series of cases around this area during the 1980s and indeed the early 1990s. In addition to that, we look at special education needs and inclusion in terms of the right and the access that children have to education provision in either their local school or indeed their local school community. Now, this was a theme that emanated from a really important special education needs report, the CERC report as we call it for short, which was published in the 1990s. It's also underpinned by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and there was also another flagship piece of legislation, the Education Act 1990, which was quite significant when we look at the understandings of inclusion in the Irish context. That act, in its long title, provided that it was an act for the education of every person in the state, the right of every person to participate in an education, to have access to an education. But importantly, it set a really important bar, a high bar in relation to quality, because it also stipulated in several sections in that Education Act that the education the child or young person receives must be appropriate to their needs. So, in addition to that, more recently, when we're talking about inclusion and this journey that we're on regarding understandings of inclusion, we're broadening the lens. We're looking at greater respect for diversity and acknowledging that all children and all young people have individual and often changing needs and interests and strengths. So from a diversity perspective, when we look at inclusion, we're recognising that all children and young people, some have different needs. Some may require support in relation to special education. Others may have particular language or communication needs, and others may need different forms of assistance in relation to self-awareness, maybe self-identity, well-being, and some children and young people have particular needs arising from socio-economic background, perhaps membership of the Traveller or Roma community. So you can see how our understanding and our journey in relation to understandings of inclusion is evolving. So essentially, if I were to summarise it, inclusion is fundamentally about meaningful participation and the engagement of every child and young person as fully as possible in their learning. It's about welcoming school communities, welcoming school cultures. It's about reducing exclusion within education and from education. Inclusion is fundamentally linked to quality. We can't talk about inclusion unless we also focus on quality and ensuring that every child and young person, no matter what their needs, strengths, capabilities, backgrounds, that they receive a quality education. So we're focused on ensuring that they have access to engaging and challenging learning activities, enabling all children to progress successfully through the education system. Now, there's one final thing I would say, that as our understanding of inclusion broadens, it's really important that we don't lose sight of the fact that there are children with very, very complex needs, and they do require specialised supports in specialised settings. So that's a really important part of our overall understanding of inclusion. So Faustina, I wonder, how does that relate to your understanding of inclusion, and what are the enablers and challenges in your own system in this regard?
What I would say is, rather than repeating what Yvonne has said, but in developing that a little bit further, I think it is crucial that we keep working at and refining what we mean by inclusion as we adapt ourselves to our rapidly changing world. You've touched, Yvonne, on some of the broader aspects of what the term means in education. And increasingly, I think I am being struck by the concept of inclusion as being something that I think we can begin to see as a principle in education in everything that we do, rather than, I think, what has happened in the past, where it has become almost like a static definition within an education policy. And I think by changing that focus and by making it a principle, as you described, in everything that we do, that does bring a range of challenges. But I think those are challenges that are worth actually looking at and trying to overcome. So I think you touched earlier, and thank you very much for your kind words about what we see as our new and transformative inspection framework. And we really are approaching inclusion through that framework, through multiple lenses. We are trying to rethink, I think, how children and young people, and let's face it, we do know, are very often labelled with a particular type of special educational needs. I struggle at times, sometimes, to accept some of the terminology that we're using now in relation to our children. But I think what we want to do is to try and encourage that broader thinking. What we hope to do, even through our inspection process, is to explore further the different ways, as Yvonne said, that all children and young people navigate the barriers and the challenges to their learning. Everyone will have barriers or challenges at some point of their education. Now, what I do want to say to this audience is that we can't do that alone. We are but one part of the education system, and as we try to explore new and innovative ways of working, I think it's really important that all of us look together at some of those issues to try and show how we can pull our learning. I'm very strongly convinced that we need government, research, business, our education practitioners working together. And I honestly believe that our inspectorates can be the catalyst for that work, because we are independent. We don't have any vested interest other than facilitating that kind of work, and I think both of us stand ready to do that. But I think whenever we look at the various new approaches to learning, I think it's really, as we said earlier, we can be optimistic also about some of the changes that are taking place. And for anyone who isn't familiar with our system, we have a very structured approach in Northern Ireland to the whole area of special educational needs. We had a 5-stage process in terms of a code of practice, which is now transitioning to a 3-stage code of practice, taking longer than any of us would have wanted it to take. But all of that culminates in a formal statementing process, which outlines the needs of the child and also gives some direction on how those needs might be met, which teachers can then address through developing either individual education plans or what in the future will be called personal learning plans. All of our schools also have a dedicated special educational needs coordinator or a learning support coordinator. And certainly from the inspectorate's perspective, we expect that person to be a member of the senior management team in a school, because we see it as being such a valuable post, and also to be the lead practitioner in the school. So, Yvonne, the rights that you have fought for have probably been recognised in Northern Ireland for a long time. But as with any very structured approach, it can become increasingly bureaucratic over time. And some of the original intention of that process can be lost. And the biggest danger of all is that the process can become an end in itself. So key challenges for us over the last number of years really have become the rapid rise in the identification of children who have special educational needs, probably in particular across the last 7 to 8 years. And when I talk about that idea of none of us can solve these problems on our own, maybe there is someone in this room, but it's certainly not me, who can explain all of that. And the only way you can begin to address that is by understanding what has happened and why and how you're going to tackle it. So by tackling that rise, that exponential rise in special educational needs in Northern Ireland, I would have to be honest and say that I don't think our response has been strategic enough, because I think that response has got to include everyone, so that our support systems to date will show wide variation, where people are working very, very hard, but quite often unsure as to what effect. And that is not a good place to be for anyone, the people who are working so hard, not knowing what those outcomes are going to be. We have a range of reports across Northern Ireland which outline over 200 recommendations in relation to improvements required in special educational needs. Now, if you think about that, if you think about all of the expertise in this room, if you think about what we bring in terms of inspection outcomes, if we'd all been working together, we might have been able to actually reduce all of that, rather than each group or each person going off and exploring what they find important or different. So there is something, I think, about how all of us as an education community come together to actually support each other, not tread on anybody else's toes, but look at the complementarity across all of the work that we do. And I think even if we think about your own role, 10, 15 years ago, certainly for us going into schools, I think there was a point in time, if we're all honest, when there was a degree of antipathy, perhaps, around practitioners seeing the value of research, or thinking, actually, that's not important to me. Practice is the most important thing. And I'm sure sometimes you thought, no, the practice will only be improved if you listen to our research. And certainly as inspectors, I think very often we would have been in the position of referring people to research, of saying, have you thought about, is this something you could consider? I can say to all of you this afternoon that that has completely changed over time. And the really good thing for me, and I'm only going to say it to this audience, is when somebody is talking to me about a piece of research in a school and I'm thinking, make a note of that in your head and go and look it up when you go home, while I nod as if I understand what they're talking about. But that is a fantastic place to be, I think, particularly from your perspective, because people really see that value and really talk about how it is impacting on their school and on the wider school improvement agenda. So importantly, in Northern Ireland at the moment, we do have an end-to-end review of special educational needs now in place. And that hopes to culminate in children having the right support at the right time, from the right people and in the right place. As simple, but as complex as that statement. So I think we can see, particularly as we talk about your work, there's a much greater appreciation of the importance of social, behavioural and emotional development and well-being of our children and young people, influencing what happens in our classrooms. Appreciation of things like the role of trauma and adverse childhood experiences, including, unfortunately, domestic violence, on the ability of a child to engage positively with their school experience and with their learning. And as I said, it's so good to see that that is coming into our schools, not in a way which is about paying lip service, but about truly trying to assimilate that into a teacher's work. I would have to say that, as Yvonne has already said, ultimately, everything in a classroom is about high quality learning and teaching. The danger there becomes that the complexity for a teacher is to take all of the things that you do and that you say and assimilate that almost seamlessly into the range of pedagogy that they deploy, depending on the children who are in front of them at any given point in time. Sometimes we see teachers or schools following a path endlessly without thinking about the fact that there are other elements of the work that you will do that can also play into that wide range of strategies that they can actually use. So I think in our most innovative practice, we see teachers using their knowledge to effect whole school improvement and to introduce approaches and strategies that ultimately benefit the well-being and inclusion, as Yvonne said, of every child. And so, Yvonne, I know you have done a lot of work in ensuring that schools are responsive to the needs of children and young people, and to ensure also that their views are not only heard, but also acted upon when important decisions are being taken, either at school level or even at policy level. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the work you have done in that area.
Thanks, Faustina. I'd be delighted to. And before I elaborate on the inspector's particular work, I would say this is a very timely question, because just last week, our Department of Education, our Education Ministry, launched an action plan. And this action plan is about ensuring that children and young people are active participants in policy making in education and in decision making. For a number of years in the inspectorate, we have been really focusing on how we engage children and young people in the inspection process more fully. And from time to time, we've also liaised with Faustina's team in Northern Ireland to develop aspects of that work. We've been very fortunate that we had the privilege of working with Professor Laura Lundy in Queen's University in Belfast in developing our approach to ensure that we really are adopting a rights-based approach. For us, this is fundamentally about children's right, their right to be heard, their right to have their voice listened to, and their rights to be active participants in decisions that affect them. The approach we're taking, in addition to being underpinned by the Lundy model of participation, and I'll elaborate a little bit more about that in a minute, is also underpinned and aligned very much with Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which requires states to take account and give due weight to the voice of children in accordance with their age and maturity in relation to matters that affect them. It's also underpinned, of course, by the UNCRPD. Now, inspection, we believe, is a matter that does affect children and young people. It's the vehicle through which we find out about their education experiences. But again, and I want to stress this, when we engage with children and young people, yes, we do want to know about how school is for them, but it's not a bald or cosmetic data gathering exercise. This is about giving them actual voice and taking account of that voice. So if I could talk a little bit about the Lundy model and its 4 elements and how we activate those in the course of our work. Those elements are space, voice, audience and influence. So looking at the theme of the conference and looking at the range of educational needs that may be out there among children, it's really important to give careful consideration to the space that's provided for children and young people to express their views. This may mean something very practical, like arranging the environment in a particular way, providing quiet corners for children to reflect, to talk to each other. It may be about providing different ways of expressing themselves. It could be through writing, drawing, not always verbally, or through conversations. Of course, it's also really, really important to acknowledge and to respect the fact that children with complex educational needs also have this very same right. And in thinking about space in this context, we need to think about accessible sensory areas in some cases. Perhaps specialised equipment is needed to enable the child or young person to express or have a real and meaningful voice. Sometimes this will involve sign language, picture boards, digital tools, eye gaze technology, and in some cases for children for whom English is an additional language, it could involve maybe translated questions, an interpreter or other such supports. So getting the space part of this model right is really, really important if we are to sincerely and authentically pursue a really inclusive agenda. Voice then is related to this. It's about getting the child or young person, assisting them or scaffolding them in some cases to enable them to express their own views. Not the views that they think adults wish them to express, but their own sincerely held views. Audience then is about the adults actively listening to the child or young person and making them feel that they value their voice, their opinions, their views. And related to that is the whole area of influence. So children and young people need to know how the inspector who has listened to their views, who is engaged in focus groups or surveys with the child or young person, what happens to all of that information that they have shared. They need to know how that feeds back into the inspection report, in the case of school inspection, or into the development of some policy and I can see Dr. Noel Purdy here today, who led very important work in the department around anti-bullying, and a really critical part of that was engaging with advisory groups of children and young people to find out their real lived experience. And again, in that instance as well, we used the Lundy model of participation. So essentially, influence is about showing the children and young people how their views can lead to real change. And so if I just to wrap up in relation to inspection, we look at this whole model of participation through three phases of the inspection process. Beforehand, we provide the children and young people with videos, with information, with the early learning and care settings, with little books about inspection, so that when we come to inspect a school or carry out an evaluation, the children, the young people know what this is all about, know that their views are going to be sought, know that their views are going to be appreciated. Then during inspection, as many other inspectorates do, we carry out surveys, but we also conduct focus groups, as indeed does Faustina's inspectorate. And these focus groups aren't structured interviews. You know, they're not closed questions. They're constructed in a way that respects those elements: space, voice, audience, and influence. And then the most recent development, and I'm really, really excited about this, we've only introduced it since September. For some of our inspections, we are now, in addition to the published inspection report that teachers and schools and boards of management and the minister and the public at large can read, we have also published a report in child-friendly language that the children and young people in that school can read what our findings were about their educational experience. So Faustina, how does that approach resonate with your experiences? And are there other ways in which you have engaged with marginalised children and young people in your system?
Thank you. Thank you, Yvonne. And yes, absolutely. I think it's important to say that when we are working collaboratively, there's no point in reinventing the wheel. And I think, one of the things that I am very grateful for is the work that Yvonne and her colleagues have done around all of that work on engaging pupil voice. And we have drawn shamelessly on some of that work in order to develop our new inspection process. And maybe just to give you a little bit of information about that so that I can then set that in the context of looking at some of our marginalised and excluded young people also. So we have stripped our inspection back to really what amount to 5 questions that a school will look at and that we will explore while we're in school. And I'll just explain those as concepts at the moment, in the sense that first and foremost, we're looking at vision. What does this organisation actually want to achieve when young people leave that organisation, whether that's early years, whether that's at the end of primary education, or whether that's at the end of secondary education? What is it that you want for these young people? And really importantly, how do they progress to the next stage of their learning? Are they ready to do that, whatever that stage might be? Secondly, I think, as Yvonne said, we're trying to look in a very bespoke way at the context in which that organisation is operating. We all say that our schools are unique, and I think it's important to take that into account whenever we are looking at the quality of education that is being provided in the school. Equally, I think how the achievements of the young people, not academic success alone, important as that may be, are recognised and celebrated. And ultimately, how children and young people are equipped with the attitudes, skills and dispositions that will allow them to survive and thrive in the future, particularly because we know through COVID that we face an increasingly volatile and uncertain world. And they have to have the resilience to cope with everything that the world will throw at them in the future. And then finally, for us, in looking at the complexities around what we're talking about today with regard to inclusion, the whole concept of school building a community of learning so that everyone who can contribute to the well-being, to the achievements of the young people in that organisation is drawn into that school community in the most appropriate way. We've only started that process. We ran pilots in the summer term. We've started the implementation of that work. I see Nuala smiling down there, and I know she'll be telling us whether it's working or not in due course, but we're delighted that that will be the case because Nuala knows we will always take that feedback and try to use it constructively as we move forward. So I think then when we look at the concept of excluded or marginalised people, again, thinking about collaborative practice, what we have tried to do is also to work with our colleagues in other types of inspectorates. And so we work in Northern Ireland with our Criminal Justice Inspectorate and with our Regulation and Quality Improvement Inspectorate also to look in a more rounded way at what the issues are that are facing young people. We conducted a joint pilot inspection in relation to safeguarding, and in safeguarding in one health trust area alone, just to allow us all to establish those ways of working. And the reason we chose to do that was that so we could aim our work at evaluating how joined up services were and how young people were experiencing them. And those young people were the young people who would be at risk and vulnerable, particularly vulnerable of entering the criminal justice system. And one of the reasons why we felt it was important to do that is because we also inspect the quality of education in our prison system. And when we listen to the narratives and the stories of those prisoners, we can see, and it is so clear, that if a young person goes into the criminal justice system, it tends to be that that trajectory continues and is downward until someone ends up in the prison system. So we tried to work together to really look at that and to see how we could give advice to all of the various services in order to improve that to our schools, to our health services and to our police service. Now, that was a starting point, and as I said, for us, what that meant was we had to do everything from scratch. And think about how much more useful that would have been for us if we had been starting from a point where a lot of the background work would have been done by people who really understood how to do that, but would have ended up with a really rounded product insofar as we would have moved further along the path than we did through a pilot. And I think increasingly as we look at these really complex issues where we can work collaboratively, we can really help those young people who do feel excluded and who are vulnerable and find those answers for them. I think similarly we worked again with young adult male prisoners in that 18 to 24 age group, and really worked particularly with our further education colleges in order to try and ensure that they would get access to much more meaningful accreditation that would allow them to take a step along that educational journey whenever they went back into the wider world. Again, in terms of some of our schoolwork, based on what we've learned from Yvonne, we've worked with our secondary school students' union in order to develop our own questionnaires. We've also worked with our children's commissioner. So I think we're all learning, I think, as we work through this process, and I think it's really important that we continue to learn from each other. So I'm going to ask Yvonne now again, do you, Yvonne, have any thoughts that you can offer us on how inspection then itself can contribute to an enabling policy environment for the future?
I do indeed, Faustina. And just before I get there, can I pick up maybe on a point around your inspection of prison systems? More recently, in the last, say, 2 years, we have started in conducting inspections, joint inspections with the Prison Inspectorate. And this has given us a new perspective on, I'll speed up here now, so I'll conclude, new perspective on areas for evaluation that we need to develop further. So in relation to how inspection can contribute to a more enabling policy climate that supports the broader aims of inclusion, I'd make 2 points in this regard: the importance of thematic reports and the importance of timely thematic reports. There's no point conducting many inspections and then waiting a year or 2 or 3 to find out what the main themes are. So we've really committed, for example, to publishing within a fairly tight time frame reports on, for example, provision for children and young people from Ukraine, provision for children and young people for whom English is an additional language, a range of reports on special education needs provision in both mainstream and special class settings and special school settings. And we've also planned a range of inspections, reporting, thematic reports, reporting on the educational experiences of traveller and Roma children and the experiences of children and young people in areas of socioeconomic disadvantage. And one final point I'd make is I think it's really important to take a design principles approach to policy making, starting with those who are hardest to reach, those most at risk of not being included, because if the policy works for them, it will work for all, and they will have been central right from the beginning.
Okay, I won't talk about that particular issue, so I'm just going to summarise for us because I know the importance of time. But really just to summarise in saying, really, I think reflecting on innovative pedagogies and inclusive education practice, I hope you will see, is a priority for all of us who work in education. I think also a commitment to equity, diversity and inclusion is reshaping now how we define success for our learners, and I think that's a really important development. The role of our teachers remains crucial in ensuring successful inclusion. The meaningful involvement of young people in the decision-making process, I think, is absolutely crucial to success from what we've said. And the inspection process then supports the enactment of policies that can embody the principles of inclusive education. So that's what we would say for our part. And I said we would finish with a challenge. And that challenge that I'm going to throw down for the conference is that imagine what might happen if we took a theme like this, like inclusive pedagogy, and if we looked at it in real time, in a real place, and explored how all of us can look at our own unique contribution to that, but then used all of that to provide a truly holistic picture that could absolutely inform future policy and practice, and policy into practice. So if anybody wants to discuss that with either Yvonne or me in the course of the conference, please feel free. We're very happy to have that conversation, and thank you for your time and good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
So our sincerest thanks to Yvonne and to Faustina, and you said at the beginning that you were going to give us an opportunity to reflect and think. I think you certainly reminded us of the complexity of our conference theme and how many different layers there are just within that one theme. I think you really reminded us of the importance of the child when we're having our conversations and keeping the child at the heart of what we do. The importance of our collective voice, not speaking as an individual, working collectively. But in particular, thank you for modelling the collaboration and the partnership through your presentation and clearly through your work. And it is that collaboration and partnership that's at the heart of Scoten. So thank you for kicking off our conference with that focus on our work together. So thank you very much. Gurmila Maggie.